This is Daniel Simon at Baton Rouge Community College, and this week I'll be moving on to talk about ancient Egypt. My primary focus this week will be on discussing the background of Egypt's geography, which had a major effect on their culture overall. I'll also talk about the rise of King Menes. Menes, of course, had eventually unifies ancient Egypt prior to the Old Kingdom coming in. And I'll talk about the background of a lot of their culture, such as mummification, the gods of Egypt. And then later in the lecture, I'll also talk about the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom, of course, was one of the three major kingdoms of ancient Egypt, along with the Middle and New Kingdoms. And I'll mostly discuss the third and fourth dynasties. Those were the dynasties that were well known for building some of the largest pyramids ever constructed in ancient Egypt, such as the Great Pyramid of Giza. I'll also talk a little bit about the later part of the Old Kingdom, and I should discuss a little bit about the hieroglyphic language of ancient Egypt and the famous Rosetta Stone. Said I'm going to get to the main lecture today. I'm going to, of course, talk about the background of ancient Egypt, kind of just talk about the early history of Egypt, kind of go into like the culture of Egypt, its geography. We'll talk about a lot about that, which is kind of important about Egypt. And we'll talk about the Nile River because, the Nile River, is really kind of instrumental in part of why Egypt exists, kind of still does today. That and you got the Suez Canal now. Of course, tourism is also big too in modern Egypt. Talk about some of the main things about Egypt. We'll get to, of course, first. Yeah, there you, of course, see an image of the pyramids. That's the thing that most people think about when they think of ancient Egypt. Those massive tombs that were built, of course, which really were built during the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom was probably one of the most famous periods of Egypt. But really only the fourth dynasty we'll talk about like later in the week is the one that really built the most largest and most famous of the pyramids, like the Giza pyramids, of course, that are right near Cairo, of course, today. So that's what people more think of when they think of Egypt. And of course, then the tomb of King Tut and all that is also kind of big in Egyptian history as well. But ancient Egypt's civilization is pretty long. It's a type of civilization that does go back thousands of years. I know it's not as old as like Mesopotamia, some of these other river valley civilizations that we've talked about before, but they do date back to at least 5 to 6,000 BC is about how far back they think Egyptian civilization started. Like in prehistoric times, although most of Egypt today, like the part we know about that we'll talk about this week and next week, most of the ancient Egyptian civilization peaked in the Bronze Age. That's when they were dominant as a culture, when they were more independent as a state, but they later got taken over by other powers. Here's kind of an image, of course, of Egypt. So Egypt's kind of located in North Africa. Part of it is also in Asia, like the part where the Sinai Peninsula is. It's actually in the southwestern part of Asia. So it's kind of a transcontinental state between Asia and Africa. It is part of the Arab Republic of Egypt. That's the official name they call the modern state of Egypt, which, by the way, has about 100 million people that live there. So it's a pretty large populated country. I think I looked it up, 14th populated nation in the world. Of course, its capital, Cairo, today, but it is famous for other cities you've heard of. Alexandria, which is on the Mediterranean Sea, later started by Alexander the Great, years later, a long time ago. And then also, don't forget Luxor, it's more on the bottom, southern part of Egypt, as well as also another major city, which a long time ago they called it Thebes in ancient times. But let me get to the main thing. Of course, I want to talk about the importance of the Nile River, to ancient Egypt. If you think about the Nile River, it's very important geographically, not just for modern Egypt. Of course, it's important for a lot of trade, especially with that. And you've got you got the Suez Canal, which is, of course, right there. It goes into the Red Sea as well. But in ancient Egypt, a long time ago, it gave birth to civilization. So without the river, there wouldn't have been anything there. Because if you know about Egypt, not just in ancient times and more in modern times, it's mostly desert. Like I want to say 90% or more of Egypt is desert, and they only actually cultivate a small percentage of the land, especially along the Nile River basin. But you can see, besides farming, they use it for fishing, trade, and economics. So it acted as kind of a highway system where it connected the northern part of Egypt with the southern part of Egypt. So you had things like that where the river was important. Also, like it's a food source: fish, crocodile, things like that. They get skin from the crocodile as well. Papyrus, type of plant, hedge plant that grows, of course, in the Nile, was used to make paper. So those are all things that were important, of course. But it wasn't wasn't just the Nile, the Mediterranean Sea, like above, if you go to that map right there, you can see how the Mediterranean Sea is above, Egypt and the Nile. They also traded, throughout, like the Mediterranean. Like I know with the Greeks and the Minoans and peoples like that, they do. Then also trade like in East Africa, like close to the Red Sea and past all that, like into Ethiopia, Somalia. They were trading in those parts of Africa, and also down into the Sudan, which is later also called Nubia in ancient times. So yeah, river is very important. You can see that's the length of the river itself. The Nile River is roughly over 4,100 miles in length. That includes its tributaries as well in Africa. It is the longest river, not just in the world, but also in Africa. You can see, but you see only 22% of the Nile's actual course runs through Egypt. The rest are in other countries. Like I think the other countries it goes through is like Ethiopia, parts of Sudan, and I think Uganda also you can include as well. And yeah, the river's kind of interesting because it flows, if you know about it, from south to north. It starts around the equator, flows northward, going down toward the Mediterranean Sea. I think it's like several thousand feet above sea level where it starts as it flows down towards, of course, where Cairo is today. I'll get more into the actual the Nile River itself. A little bit about Herodotus. Herodotus was one of the first to write about Egypt. I think I talked about Herodotus before, how he was one of the first to write a series of books about history. They call it Histories of Herodotus or History of the Persian Wars. And in book 2 of his histories, he wrote kind of an extensive history of Egypt. The reason why was because the Persian Empire conquered it. And so that was in the 6th century BC. And so he wanted to include kind of a history of that. There's actually stories where they think that Herodotus may have actually gone to Egypt, like went there, visited it. And his most famous quote he said about Egypt was, you see there, Egypt was the gift of the Nile. And so what he meant by that was the fact that he felt like the river had kind of given birth to the civilization because it helped, facilitate, I guess, development of agriculture, and agriculture led to civilization. And so hence that term, of course, kind of coming about because of that. However, the ancient Egyptians thought that the river was the flood, like the annual flood that came in the summer, every year, was caused by a god, which I'll get to later. I think the god was named Hapi. I think it was the name Hapy or Hapi. And so they thought the gods caused the flood, but in reality, it was actually the monsoon seasons that hit parts of Africa, East Africa, that actually caused the rivers to swell up and flood. But they didn't know that, of course, a long time ago. So there's Herodotus, like when I said, one of the first traveled to maybe Egypt. And he actually wrote about the pyramids, things like that. We'll talk about later. Wrote about mummification, things like that. And he's really the oldest source really on those kinds of things. Here's another view of, by the way, of ancient Egypt and kind of where it's actually located. So, if you know about Egypt, it's divided into two areas. They have an area which is the upper part of Egypt, which is the southern part of Egypt, actually, where the river begins. It's more down to where Karnak is, and really the city of Luxor is on the bottom. Aswan, High Dam, and all that's down there as well. And then the northern part of Egypt is what they call the lower Egypt, which mostly is like around the Delta area. So Saqqara, Giza, Cairo, and all that would kind of be included in those areas that you're looking at. So that's how they use it. I think there's kind of a middle Egypt that's kind of between lower and upper Egypt, but people don't use that term much today. But that's just geographic terms that they often talk about with Egypt, not just in ancient times, but I guess in modern times also. Here's a kind of another view also of Egypt. I think it's kind of a mix of modern, ancient terms also on there as well. But you see all the different cities that were there some long time ago, like Memphis, of course, was one of the capitals of ancient, like administrative capital, like ancient Egypt. And then, of course, you have Cairo, which is kind of right nearby. Of course, the main capital of Egypt. You can see Alexandria, which, of course, is also where the delta is on the Mediterranean Sea. They have. I'll kind of talk about it now. Now, since we're talking about the Nile, the term Nile is derived from Greek, from the word Nilos, which I think there's different theories about where the name came from. But I think the Greeks kind of viewed Nilos or Nilus as like some kind of river god of some type. So that's, they think, where the term actually came from. And there's different variations of the spelling. So Nilos, Nilus, and Nile, I think it was an Arabic variation of it that they have. And I think there's been some debate about what it meant in Greek. I've seen like some terms where it says it means the river or great river or great canal, might be a translation of it. But that's not what the Egyptians called it. I think there's some belief that the Egyptians named it after the actual Egyptian god of the flood. I told you, Hapi. They think that's actually what they called the Nile a long time ago. You can see the river empties out into a large-sized delta, which a lot of rivers do, like the Mississippi River, like in Louisiana, which the term delta, if you know about it, evolved from the Greek alphabet. The letter delta, which you may have seen, looks like a kind of a triangle, and so it's kind of a triangle shape to it. You can see where the river flows into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile Delta has two main branches. The Nile River Delta, there's one branch called Rosetta that you see is kind of on the left, western side of it, closer to Alexandria. And then the other one is called the Damaida branch, which is more to the eastern part of the delta of the Nile. And I'll get to it later, but that's where they get the term Rosetta Stone from, because that's where the Rosetta Stone was found, that little town that's in the delta, Rosetta, today. Here's more of an image from outer space, kind of showing you what the Nile River and its delta looks like. So most of the rest of Egypt is desert. You'll see sometimes some oases that are kind of out there, that are outside the river, like the Fayum, I think, oasis, which is kind of to the west of it, right there. Those are just images you'll sometimes see, of course, of the river. Here's another view, of course, of the Nile with the different countries that it kind of goes through. It does have two main sources of the Nile. That they have the Blue Nile and the White Nile, which the Blue Nile starts in like Ethiopia and flows into Sudan, and then of course they meet together with the White Nile, which the White Nile they think starts way down in Uganda, but they think it actually goes all the way down into Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria, and so I think most of the river, like the source of the river, I don't know if you know much about the Nile River, but the majority of the water that goes down the Nile comes from Ethiopia, like the Blue Nile. I think there's been some controversy between Egypt and, of course, Ethiopia with them trying to stop some of the water flow going into Egypt. I think I've got some other views right here. The river does after it forms that Khartoum in Sudan. The blue and the white now meet, converge together, and then from there it form one trunk as it goes up into northern Sudan, Upper Sudan, and there's like these so-called cataracts that the river down, which are a series of waterfalls. The word cataract is a Greek word, cataracta meaning waterfall, and a long, long time ago, a lot of the British back in the 1800s were some of the first to actually explore that area. Like you may have heard of Dr. David Livingstone and Henry Stanley Morton, I think were famous, yeah, for kind of exploring that area of, of, of Egypt in modern times. And so they numbered it backwards from 1 to 6. They had to climb up a lot of the waterfalls as they went up into Sudan, actually. They went more up, of course. So it's kind of talking about the cataracts, and um, it's very hard to navigate, of course, the Nile as you get into Sudan because of all the, not just the waterfalls, but it's got a lot of rapids and also sometimes go down the Nile as well. Here's other images kind of showing, it's kind of how drastic the Nile is. So you could have 1 foot in the desert, like in the kind of desert areas, and then you got the fertile areas along the river. So it's only along the river that the Egyptians cultivate a lot of their crops throughout Egypt, except maybe certain oases I was talking about. And in ancient Egypt, they called Egypt Kemet, which meant the black land, which because of the fertile soil of course of Egypt, which was a natural silt that flowed from the river. They used that to grow crops throughout Egypt, and so that's the name that they used. And then I think later in Greek times, the word Egypt is supposedly a variation of the word Kemet. So you're kind of looking at that right there. They also have what they call Deshret as well. You'll sometimes see that term being used also as well, Deshret, which is like, I think I've got that term I'll put on the screen right here for you, but Deshret is a term that talks about, well, it's 2 different things. It means red land in hieroglyphs, but it talks about how the different parts of Egypt, like the deserts, were like what they call that. But it was also a term they used for the lower part of Egypt, especially around the Delta area, because I'll get to it later, that Egypt kind of separates into 2 states, an upper Egypt kingdom and a lower Egypt kingdom. The lower Egypt kingdom was called Deshret because the king wore a red crown. So they call it red land. But the desert areas were often called Deshret too, which mostly were infertile. Here's kind of another image so you can see how drastic the difference, like I told you, is between basically the fertile areas and the areas that are, of course, not. And you can see it from Google Earth. Like, look at Google Earth, of course, of Egypt. You can pretty much see the same thing. What kind of crops did they grow in ancient Egypt? That varied. But they're kind of almost similar to like what they grew in Mesopotamia. But flax is something they grew a lot in ancient Egypt, which flax was used to make linen, which is a type of cloth they use, which they use that for clothing. They put it on the mummies and all that too, like the mummy wrappings on the mummification thing they did. Use that for wheat and barley were kind of considered like their main grain crops, along with sorghum. So those 3 right there, where a lot of that like wheat and so on were used to make like bread, which is a common staple, especially for the lower classes. Papyrus, which I already mentioned about, was like a hedge plant that grew in the Nile, was used to make paper. They also made boats out of it, like reed boats were made from it. Of course, date palm, which they used the date. The wood from the tree was used for different things. Sesame was grown like in Mesopotamia. Figs, different kinds of fruits and vegetables were also grown throughout Egypt. So kind of similar to like what you see in Mesopotamia as well, kind of crops that are being grown. Here's kind of a image of like the different growing seasons that they had in ancient Egypt, which there was only like three main growing seasons they had the most. The one at the top, which usually goes from about June to about, it says about October, is what they call the Akhet. The Akhet was the most important season they had in Egypt. It's actually supposedly means in hieroglyph inundation, not flooding. And when the river would gradually increase in water, rise up by many feet. And depending on, how much water they got, that dictated basically what kind of growing season they were going to have. So if they didn't have enough water, it would be a drought, possibly. That could happen. Also, if it flooded too much, it could obviously flood like cities and villages, which was another problem they could have as well. They also have what they call the Peret, which is the sowing season, where they would kind of plant crops basically during the year, which that mostly happened during, I think the months they have for is like October to February would be when they would plant crops, which some of those like could be obviously plant some in the fall, plant some in the spring. So let's debate about that when they would plant, because most people plant crops like farmers or whatever usually two times a year, once in the spring, one in the fall, and also harvest too. Same thing. We'll harvest some things in the fall and harvest some things in the spring. So that kind of thing. So yeah, they have like basically three growing seasons, but kind of like in Louisiana, we're close to the equator. It's pretty warm there also year round. So they don't really get a winter. Sometimes we get snow here, but it's once every a bunch of years. That we have snow very rarely. So we're almost like subtropical Louisiana, and so yeah, Egypt is kind of close to the equator, right above it. Yeah, there's kind of an image showing the Nile River, by the way, flooding. So yeah, up to like I think the 1950s, 1960s, the river would flood. So they'd have problems with flooding. They'd have to deal with. They didn't have a levee system like they had, like we have, like in Louisiana, a lot along the Mississippi River, we have like this levee system that we built to kind of prevent all that kind of flooding. But the Egyptians had this thing they built along the actual river called a nilometer. I don't know if you've ever heard about these, but nilometers were like these flood towers that they built along the Nile to measure like the flood stage of the river, so they could figure out what kind of flood season they're going to get. And it would go into this tower structure, and they could measure how high the water was going to be for that year, so they could figure out if it was going to be a drought or if there was going to be too much water and it might flood towns or villages. And so they knew it was going to flood too much. They could then evacuate cities and villages. But what happened, these nilometers became obsolete. When they built the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, it made a lot of those obsolete because they can control the flooding now more. So anyway, that's kind of discussing about that issue. Let me get next. I'll kind of just for a few minutes talk about prehistoric Egypt, which, yeah, they do have some prehistory of Egypt. They kind of just mentioned for a short time about that. Egypt itself does go back a long way. So 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, they think Egypt may have started in prehistoric times. I would put it kind of, during the Neolithic period. They think farming started 5,000 BC, maybe the furthest back. And it's believed that predominantly farming started in that Fayum oasis I showed you, which is kind of to the west of the Nile. So that's, they think, where it started from. And then over time, the Egyptians spread up and down the river from like the delta down into the upper part of Egypt. So it took a while for this to actually happen, but it did. And Egypt was not really a unified state. It was a collection of city-states, which were called a nome, or nomes, if you want the plural version of it. And the word nome derived from local chieftains that controlled each city-state, which was called a nomarch. And so the term kind of stuck. I think the term nomarch is kind of where the Egyptians get these like chancellors or viziers that kind of control the state, which are later like under the pharaohs that are kind of ruling as governors. Yeah, at one point there are 42 of them that actually control all of Egypt, but eventually they unify as like a kingdom or an empire. I think I've got some other images kind of showing the difference. Yeah, there, of course, the difference between Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Again, I'll kind of get to that in a second and talk about because they do have different states that are comprised of what becomes, Egypt. However, let me classify first who the Egyptians are. The Egyptians were considered today, anyway, back then in ancient times, they're considered Afro-Asiatic peoples, more the Hamitic part of peoples that are in North Africa. We talked about like the Kushites, I think was one group, the Berber in Egyptian would kind of be all classified as kind of similar cultures that were in North Africa, but they're multi-ethnic. So it's like, they always talk about this idea of black and white Africa, like up in Egypt, that kind of thing in North Africa. But they really weren't. They were more homogenous races, because you'll see people dark skin, light skin, that kind of thing. Especially in North Africa, there's just mixes of different peoples that are a mix of probably Semitic, African type peoples that are everywhere. In Egypt today, it's still like that. Although I think Egypt's mostly Arabic, the people that have settled there. But Egyptians, you'll see different colored peoples that are light skinned to, you'll see like people like my color, and you'll see people like almost like African also as well. And yet other people came in, like the Europeans came, like the Greeks settled there, Romans came in later, Arabs eventually came in, Turks, I think, also came into Egypt also as well. Now, I want to get into and talk about the different states back in prehistoric times, like at the end of the, they think the new Stone Age, Neolithic times. They do think there were two states that evolved into kingdoms, which may date back to, I don't know, they're not sure how far they go back to 3,500 BC. But they had two states. They had the so-called Lower Kingdom or Lower Egypt that emerged, which would be in the northern part of Egypt today, where the delta is. That king had a red crown that he wore, which was called a deshret. And then they had what they call the Upper Kingdom or Upper Egypt, which the king wore a white crown. And so they call that crown a hedjet. And some of the Egyptians, I think, may have called it like the Lower Egypt. They call it the Red Land or Deshret, I told you. And then they actually did sometimes call the Upper Kingdom or Upper Egypt the White Land. So they kind of use those terms because of the different crowns that were being used. I think I've got an image of the different crowns also as well. So the one on the left you see is the white crown I'm talking about. Which I told you is called the hedjet, and then the red crown, it's called the deshret, and each one has a symbol. By the way, the Lower Egypt, of course, has a vulture as main symbol on the headdress, of course. Then the Upper Egypt's kingdom's crown, the red one, has a cobra. So a vulture and a cobra right there. The two different ones. And they combine them later. You can see the crowns and it's red and white with the white on top with the red, of course, on the bottom. They have different names. They call the double crown, if you want to know it. I don't know if it's that important, but in ancient Egypt, they called the double crown Shemti, I think is the common name they would say in hieroglyphs. And then the Greek name is, I think they pronounce it skent or something like that. Is how they said it basically, and that's the different names that they call the actual double crown that was worn by the pharaohs that later come to power, of course, in Egypt. And they do think there was a king that unified Egypt. You see there, his name was King Menes, who I'll get to later has another name. They also called him King Narmer also. Let me explain the term pharaoh, though. The term pharaoh, which is, the name that they use for the kings of Egypt, that term was not used until the New Kingdom. They don't really use it until later. I want to say the 12th, not 12th, the 19th dynasty, I think, was the dynasty they think start using it. Anyway, the term pharaoh supposedly was actually where the actual king ruled from. Supposedly the word pharaoh meant great house or royal palace, and so that later became the name that they called the rulers of Egypt. So pharaoh, and so that particular pharaoh we're talking about that unified Egypt, his name was King Menes, who you see there, the first major pharaoh of Egypt. He does have different names. The Egyptians themselves had their own name that they called him, which was Narmer, and then the Greeks later called him the name Menes. Also, there's a third name. I think there's two Greek names. There's Menes, which is more popular, and there's another name which is Men, either M-E-N or M-I-N, I think is a variation of how it's also spelled. And so you'll see a lot of the pharaohs have two different names. They got the Egyptian hieroglyphic name they find later, and then they have the name that the Greeks call them also. Usually I'll put those in parentheses or something like that. Here's kind of an image of Menes, by the way, and of course what he did as a pharaoh. So he's really considered to be the first king of what they call the first dynasty of ancient Egypt, which I think Egypt had something like 31 dynasties at one point. There's a debate about when he reigned. So they're not sure, like 32nd century to maybe close to the 30th century BC. They're not sure like when he was around as a pharaoh. They do think that he was a king that reigned in the upper kingdom, upper Egypt, and he took over Egypt and he unified it into one state. So you see, the first pharaoh to unify Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom is the main thing that Menes, of course, would do. And then he created their capital. I told you about Memphis being the administrative capital of ancient Egypt. That's the location of where he would basically put his main palace that he would reign from. Thebes would later arise as a major city too in Egypt, but that won't happen until like around the middle to New Kingdom when it becomes like a center as a capital. But it was more of a cult center more than anything. So he starts to facilitate trade throughout Egypt, connecting the different states and provinces throughout Egypt. And then, of course, he was one of the first to wear the double crown. I was still when where he took the white and the red crown and he combined them together. There's this thing called the Narmer palette that was found in Egypt, I want to say in 1897 or 98. And it's a type of cosmetic palette that actually depicts Narmer's or Menes's reign. So they do think he was a real ruler of Egypt. I think they had other pharaohs of Egypt that they kind of know about a little bit about, especially the Upper Kingdom. But they think a lot of those, some of those might be mythological, so they're not sure if they're real or not. But they do think he was real because of this, archaeological fact. This stone artifact that was found by British archaeologists. And what it does, it actually depicts not just Narmer, but him unifying the state. I think I've got a slide here showing you some of the things that's on it. So on the left, it shows Narmer with the crown of Upper Egypt. And then on the right, he's got also the crown of Lower Egypt that he's wearing. So he goes from basically conquering the lower part of Egypt, and then I think it shows him like beheading his enemies, of course, on the right with that as well. And I think it has some brief hieroglyphics on it as well. So this type of stone artifact is considered one of the oldest of its kind in from ancient times. Might be one of the oldest stone artifacts ever found. So it's kind of debate about when it dates to, but like I said, maybe close to the 30th or 31st century BC may have been when he reigned as ruler. But they consider it to be like the so-called pre-dynastic period of when Narmer or Menes reigned, which I think is the first and second dynasties, because the third dynasty is the one that starts the Old Kingdom, which is later. Now, talk about it for a few minutes. They do divide Egyptian history, like ancient Egyptian history, into different historical periods. The main ones, of course, that we'll talk about the most is the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. I'll probably try to get into some Middle Kingdom too, as well this week. Actually, next week. But Old Kingdom, you can see there it's when the pharaohs kind of come to power and they began to consolidate the state into a centralized government. And of course, they build the pyramids. At the peak of the pyramids, of course, were constructed at that time, which the most famous we'll get to later is the Giza pyramids, which were mostly built, of course, by the Fourth Dynasty, the most famous dynasty, of course, the Old Kingdom. However, the country struggled later. You can see power struggles, crop failures, the cost of the pyramids eventually caused the collapse of the Old Kingdom, and it did. Middle Kingdom came back later, so you can see the different periods. Old Kingdom was like early Bronze Age, 26th to the 22nd century BC. Middle Kingdom's more like 21st to the 17th century BC. And you can see how several things happen under them. But one big thing you see there, they start trading with different people. So you see they trade different parts of the Middle East. Crete with the Minoans, start trading with Minoans and all of that. Also, I'll get to it later, but pyramid building kind of stops at that point in the Middle Kingdom. Thebes becomes kind of an important city as well. It kind of becomes almost like a capital of Egypt during the Middle Kingdom. And then at the end of the Middle Kingdom, they get invaded by these peoples called the Hyksos, who are based in the Levant, where close where Israel, Lebanon is. They actually get occupied, especially in the lower part of Egypt. Then they have the New Kingdom also as well that comes in later between the 16th and 11th centuries. And that was really the peak of Egypt, especially at the end of the Bronze Age. And their state becomes more like an empire. I think some people call it the Pharaonic Empire or New Empire of Egypt, where it expands all the way into Syria to the Euphrates River Valley. You got Hatshepsut. We'll get to later. Queen Hatshepsut is kind of a famous female ruler they have that reigns. She encourages trade, especially in East Africa, well known. Also, you got a lot of famous rulers like King Tut, Tutankhamun, that kind of comes in later, more known for his tomb they discovered in 1922. Then Ramses the Great was like one of their peak rulers they had, of course, but Egypt after that began to decline. I've got even more extensive, like you can see here, it's kind of the Egyptian timeline. They do break it down into different periods. They have these so-called intermediate periods that kind of occur between the three major kingdoms. First intermediate period, second intermediate period, third intermediate period, where Egypt kind of breaks up and there's a lot of chaos throughout the period of their history. And then you have these other periods that kind of like the late period. Egypt's declining and they're occupied by foreign powers you get the Assyrians come in at one point, Persians, Greeks, Romans later occupy their history also as well. So, but most of Egypt's, I guess when they're most powerful is predominantly in the Bronze Age. When the Iron Age comes in, they start declining. That's one thing that happens. Now, let me talk about also religion as well, which the Egyptians drastically had a lot of gods. They had probably a couple thousand gods. I know we'll kind of get into some of the ones that were the most famous that they had. You can I'll kind of show you some right here. You can see, but some of the ones that are famous, you can see in that list: Isis, Osiris, Ra, Horus, Anubis, Sobek, Thoth, Hathor, Amun, and Set. So those are some famous gods you can see there. Of course, King Tut right there in his tomb on the right in that image with that slide. But they had different gods. Their chief deity, the one that was the most famous, is the god Amun. Amun became part of the state religion of Egypt. In fact, by the we get up to the New Kingdom, the cult of Amun Ra, or cult of Amun, as they call it sometimes, becomes like a state cult religion, which is centered in the upper part of Egypt, in Thebes. It becomes like a major city of Egypt later, where Luxor is today in Egypt. That's where they have this huge temple they built, which is like something like several hundred acres in size, called the Temple of Karnak, or Karnak Temple Complex. And Egypt over time became a theocracy where they have these pharaohs that were all powerful, but in reality, the religion controlled the land more than anything. But Amun was considered their most powerful god. In fact, the word Amun means, supposed in hieroglyphs, the hidden one. It later was merged with the god Ra, which is the Egyptian sun god. And so later, they kind of view these gods as kind of being the same or similar. But also the fact that the Egyptians kind of viewed all of the gods as almost like manifestations of Amun Ra. Like any god you're talking about, they're all kind of linked to each other. The Greeks saw Amun as like Zeus or Jupiter to them. So they saw it as this all-powerful god, God, the father of all the gods. And so a lot of the Greeks would often call Amun or Amun Ra Zeus Amun. I think Alexander the Great and others probably called it something like that. Of course, other chief gods they had too that were famous. Anubis, which you've kind of seen before, was the so-called jackal head god of ancient Egypt. He's mostly associated with like Egyptian funerary practices, like embalming of the dead, and he's kind of like a judge of the dead too in the afterlife. And so the Egyptians kind of connect him to a lot of the rituals and processes of when they would bury people and things like that. Because quite often, a lot of the priests that would do that would wear a jackal mask that represented that. A lot of their gods are anthropomorphic. You'll see them like part animal, part human. And jackals are kind of like hyenas, kind of, scavenging off the dead and things like that. Other gods they had, Horus was a very important god in Egyptian mythology. Horus was often seen as the god that was the embodiment of the pharaoh in ancient Egypt when the pharaoh was on the throne. And he was mostly several things. He was a sky god. He was a falcon god. He was part falcon, part man. He was also a war god. I kind of compared almost like a Egyptian version of maybe Mars or Ares. And he was the son in different kinds of mythologies, either the son of Osiris and Isis, or also sometimes the son of also Ra and Hathor. So there's different variations of who his parents are. I know Osiris and Isis are more popular. But usually when the pharaoh was on the throne, he was seen as a living god, like Horus. And then when he would die, he would kind of become like Amun Ra. So quite often, a lot of images you'll see Horus with that double-headed crown, like the red and white crown we talked about, of course, that kings would wear as well. They also have Isis. They also have Hathor, which is kind of similar. They're kind of similar goddesses to each other. And both those goddesses were kind of seen as these chief goddesses of like fertility, of course, but also things like sex, marriage and women, and also alcohol, like kind of a goddess of brewing that we've talked about before. as well. Usually, when they see Isis, I think afterwards, kind of similar looking. She'll usually be the image of a woman with cow horns above her head, where the cow horns, I think, represent like fertility. That's her giving eternal life to, of course, Queen Nefertari, who was later a famous wife and queen of Ramses the Great. The Ankh is a symbol, of course, of of, of eternal life, because the Egyptians believed that that your soul was eternal, that maybe couldn't die, especially if your body was left intact and mummified. They also have Osiris. You may have heard of him. He's well known in Egyptian mythology. Might have been one of the oldest gods that go back to like the Old Kingdom. Osiris is like the god of the underworld in Egyptian mythology, or king of the dead, if you want to call it. And there's beliefs in the ancient Egyptians that Osiris was believed to be like a king that lived a long time ago in Egypt. It's also a god of fertility. And he was married to Isis, I told you that fertility goddess that's well known. And so their main son is believed to be in some mythology, of course, Horus, of course. And there's a famous story which is well known in ancient Egypt, which is called the Osiris myth, which is this mythological story that tells how Osiris goes from becoming this king of Egypt that lived like a long time ago. Maybe he lived in prehistoric times, I don't know. And over time, he became resurrected as the king of the dead. And what happened in the story was he had this brother named Set, who wanted the throne of Egypt. Set later is kind of viewed as this Egyptian god associated with things like chaos, deserts, infertility, and also storms as well. And he seized the throne by murdering his brother. He killed his brother, uh, threw his body parts, I think, into a chest and put them into floated them on the Nile River. And of course, what happened in the myth, if you story about the story, Isis recovered his body parts, and had him mummified. Uh, it's one whole, I guess, body basically. And so the Egyptians believed that if your soul was going to make it into the next world, like underworld or whatever, you had to be intact. And so that's why everybody wanted to be mummified, etc. So I guess he's considered the first to be mummified, and so you'll see a lot of images of him being mummified, like on the right. He's got the double-hatted crown, of course. Also the crook of the flail. You'll notice that those are symbols of a lot of the pharaohs of Egypt that they'll have like across their chest. I think you see it with like King Tut when they opened his actual coffin, the Valley of the Kings. But I think they say it represented the fact that maybe a long time ago, the ancient Egyptians were shepherds, just kind of that's connected to like a whip and a crook there. You see, like we're shepherding like sheep or whatever. And so they think that's where that originated from, the actual symbols. They're Set. They think he may have been some kind of cat god in ancient Egypt mythology. There's a debate about whether he may have been a king too. At one point, maybe took the throne for a while. But what happened was Horus, he was the son of Osiris and Isis, fought Set for the crown and defeated him. And so that's why the pharaohs of Egypt became connected to Horus instead. Also, there's another guy you may have heard named Thoth or Thoth. It's pronounced either way, I guess. He's a famous bird god in ancient Egypt, who's connected to like writing and wisdom and knowledge, also mathematics and science as well. And he's this moon god that they say gave the Egyptians papyrus that grew along the Nile River, which they used to make paper out of. And so they think he gave them like writing, like hieroglyphs, like to write their ancient language down. as well. And so he's kind of an important figure in also ancient Egyptian mythology. So it was like kind of like a white crane bird, Thoth or Toth. Oh, you may have heard of Sobek. That's also another kind of popular god as well. That's well known. Sobek, of course, is mostly a god associated with crocodile, the crocodile god in ancient Egypt. And I think they say the power center of Sobek, you see, was at Fayoum, that oasis I told you in city, which is kind of west of the Nile, where they think Egypt may have started a long time ago, prehistoric times. But the crocodile is important. They use it as a food source. They use it the leather as well. It also represented supposedly the pharaoh, like the power of the pharaoh, male fertility, and then also their I guess the pharaoh's armies was also associated with that particular god also. But yeah, the Egyptians had many gods. That's just some of them that were well known. They may have had hundreds, and they may have worshipped at one point. But I know, like the chief guy we'll get to later, like at Karnak at Thebes, was Amen, and Amen was, like I said, I'll tell you, the state god and cult that pretty much ran the country. Okay? The pharaoh becomes more like a theocracy, his power. Let me get into one more thing today. I want to talk about also mummification as well. That's something that the ancient Egyptians, of course, are very famous for, where they embalm people, of course, for the afterlife. And the proper name they use for mummification is Egyptian funerary practices. The term mummification, I'll kind of explain to you. It's kind of an accident. It kind of came about more into modern times. But the actual like knowledge about how the ancient Egyptians buried people is gotten from Herodotus. So you see in that image, Herodotus has the oldest accounts really on how they buried people in ancient times, and kind of show you right here this image here. But this is from like book 2 of Herodotus's Histories of Herodotus, where he kind of goes into some of the things of how they basically would mummify people. And of course, one of the things he talks about is that they, of course, would remove the organs. It's one of the first things that they would do from the body. They remove the brain. According to Herodotus, they would use some kind of iron hook or some kind of hook. It may have been bronze, where they would basically remove your brain through your cavity, through your I guess through your sinus cavity behind your nose, and they wouldn't keep that though. So they would throw the brain away basically, and then they would cut the side of the body. You can see there, cut them with a flint knife of some type, and they would remove all the contents of the abdomen. The only thing they would keep in the body supposedly was the heart. They would keep that in the body because the Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, your heart would be weighed. I think it gets a feather or something like that, the so-called weighing of the heart, where Anubis would judge you in the afterlife, how if you were good or bad, that kind of thing. Your soul could still be destroyed if you were like evil person, or maybe your body wasn't intact and things like that. That could happen as well. He says then they would cleanse and wash the body out. He says by these wine, maybe, and spices, maybe that may have been used. And then they would fill the body with different things. He's got different ideas what they would fill inside the body. Pure myrrh has kind of been a debate about what myrrh is. I think some people think it was some kind of tree resin they may have used inside the body. Cassia is like cinnamon bark is what it actually is. Other perfumes. They may have stuffed linen inside the body too, as well. And then they would place the body in what they called natron for 70 days. I'll get to that in a second. But natron is a type of mineral salt that they would cover the body in to kind of dry it out. Which mineral salt is kind of like similar to baking soda. And I'll get to it later where it was found. It was found in the deserts of Egypt. But that was the longest aspect of the actual. I think it took 70 days total to basically do the mummification Yeah, body is washed and then wrapped from head to foot in linen. They would wrap the body in linen bandages, basically. Then they would put some kind of coating on the outside that was kind of like a glue, but they think it was some kind of like a type of resin that they used, which I'll explain kind of was made out of like asphalt material. Then they would take the body and they would put it like in a maybe in a like coffin or chamber, that kind of thing afterwards. So he kind of goes into how basically people were mummified, they think, but I think there's a theory that there may have been some kind of embalming handbooks that actually told people how to, like priests or whatever, how to do the process. But now it's kind of missing. But yeah, they think that what they call asphalt or bitumen, which is a kind of like a modern names they use now, may have been used in the actual mummification process. And later, it was also called by the Arabs mumia. Yeah, mumia. Mumia is a type of resinous bitumen that was used in all kinds of things. It was used in embalming. They used it in medicines. Like I think in the Greeks and Romans started using it to help heal like wounds and cuts and things like that. People also took it for internal medicine, like for stomach ailments and ulcers and things like that. I think for headaches too, believe it or not, Mamiya. I think they may have even put it on bone fragments, like fractures and things like that as well. But the term asphalt was a term that was coined by the Greeks. Asphaltos, I think was the word they used for it. And then the scientific name is bitumen that they have today. Some people also call it like a type of pitch, like a type of tar pitch or asphalt pitch as well. So that may have been the resin that they put on the outside of the mummy. And there's cases where they actually would take the outside of the mummy and grind it down and make it into like a powder. They could call it mummy powder, and people would take it as a drug, which was ineffective, by the way. Didn't really work. But people thought you could take it as a drug that could help heal you. There's, of course, that's the actual mummy of King Tut. You see that Howard Carter, of course, has opened. They think they poured it on the actual, like the actual mummies. They take the mummy and pour it on it. They think that's why a lot of the mummies are actually black looking, like so dark black looking, because of the mumia that was put on the actual mummies. Yeah, it's like say it may have taken up to 70 days actually to totally complete the mummification. I forget how long they covered the body in that mineral salt, but that was done for several weeks. But the actual process itself took, you can see, up to like 10 weeks. So pretty long time that it took. And like I told you, the chief embalmer would often wear the jackal mask, which represented Anubis, the god associated with mummification and embalming. Yeah, that's the natron. They talk about natron. It's called different names, which is the type of mineral salt that was used in the process to dry out the body, which is really one of the main processes that they used, which took the longest, which I think it took like something like, I think it would cover the body maybe in 40 days. So more than half the time they would cover the body in this whitish material. And it was called, they called it natron because of the fact that it came from this desert. Actually, not a desert, it was a salt lake, which is west of the Nile, called the Wadi Natron. And so hence the name being used. But today, natron it's still used today, like as a type of soap and cleaner and things like that. They use it for. It's very similar to baking soda, not quite, but like sodium bicarbonate or something like that is, I think, what actually is. So there you got kind of different mummies that you're looking at right there that they have, and they did have this deal where they had these gods that actually protected your organs. They were called the four sons of Horus. You may have heard about them, and each one of these gods would protect certain organs that would go into canopic jars, which canopic jars were these pottery jars where they put your organs into. So they probably put natron in that. as well. And the four gods were Dalmatef, Kabesanef, Hapi, and Seti. So Dalmatef is the one that's on the far left at the top. He looks like a jackal. That one would protect your stomach organs. Kabesanef, which is on the bottom left, was like a falcon type god. He would protect your intestines. I think most of your lower ones. Hapi, which is to the top right, looks like a baboon. He, of course, will protect your lungs. And then Seti on the bottom right, which looks like a human, will protect your liver. It's spelled different ways, sometimes with an I, but it's just a transliteration of the hieroglyphs. So those are all the different guys. And I think they took the canopic jars and they would just put them in your coffin, is what they would do. There may have been some case where they put it actually inside the mummy, but I think they didn't do that much as well. But yeah, the Egyptians took it pretty seriously, the afterlife. They really thought there was an afterlife. They would even sometimes put in food and other things like that, drink that they would need for the next life. There's even a case where they put statues of like servants that they thought could come alive, and help them in the afterlife. Have even boats. Like some of the pharaohs built like boats they thought they would need in the next world and stuff like that. So now I'll get to it later. Some of the Egyptians even have what they call the Book of the Dead, which were like these spells and incantations that would help them, travel through the underworld. And I think by the fifth dynasty, they even started writing them on the walls, like so-called pyramid texts inside their pyramids. So yes, they really took the idea of the afterlife pretty seriously. And gods like Amun Ra, were kind of seen as eternal, etc. Now, next week, not this week and next week, I'll be getting into also talking about the different kingdoms. I know this week I'll mostly talk about the Old Kingdom, which is the age of pyramids. So we'll talk about the different pyramids that were constructed during Egyptian times. I'll get to the Middle Kingdom a little bit. I'll kind of just briefly talk about the Middle Kingdom, and then I'll move on to the New Kingdom, which is the peak period of ancient Egypt, especially by the time of the end of the Bronze Age. So we'll get into that, all the different famous pharaohs that of course, happened during that time period that were kind of in power. Egypt itself, goes back, like I told you before in that previous lecture, several thousand years. But the Old Kingdom it starts in the, would be like the late Bronze Age, is when it really takes off. And here you kind of see an image, of course, of the Giza pyramids with the Great Sphinx, of course, sitting right in front of it. We'll talk about the Sphinx, of course, later as well. But Egypt itself had, I'll kind of talk about the different dynasties that really made it up. It had like a total of kind of show kind of a period. You can by the way, see the different kingdoms we've already talked about before: Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, which are the three major kingdoms of ancient Egypt. Of course, the one on the left you see there is the one we'll kind of talk about mostly today. They do have intermediate periods. I'll kind of talk off and on about those, also historical periods in ancient Egypt. Then you have all the later periods that come after the decline of the New Kingdom, of course, which is more into the Bronze Age. We're more into the really Iron Age, but we're talking more about the Bronze Age, of course, with this particular lecture. But yeah, those are the different dynasties. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth dynasties are usually the ones that are included in what they call the Old Kingdom period, one of the three major kingdom periods of ancient Egypt. You can see it's a period of prosperity where the kingdom was unified as a major power, mostly based in the Nile River basin is where it's at. But you see there, the one thing that they're real known for, of course, in ancient Egypt during the Old Kingdom, of course, was the construction of a lot of burial grounds throughout Egypt. One thing about the Egyptians built a lot of necropolis sites throughout Egypt where they buried their dead. I think these are the list of the main, necropolis sites that were well known in Egypt. Abydos, which I'll talk about first, is really considered to be the one site that was the oldest, that goes back something like 5,000 years ago. when it was first started, that burial site, which is also a city as well. These cities of the dead, of course, Saqqara, of course, another site near Memphis, was where a lot of the kings of, like, I think starting around the third dynasty started also burying pharaohs there. Midim, Dashur, those are necropolis sites that are kind of south of Cairo, like about 20, 30 miles to the south of the Delta. And then Giza, fourth dynasty necropolis site near Cairo, of course, was where they built the pyramids of Giza, like the Great Pyramid was constructed there. They do have the Valley of the Kings, which wasn't built till the New Kingdom. That's a necropolis site too, which was more like famous for like the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties, burying pharaohs there. They built rock-cut tombs, like burying to the mountains of the Valley of the Kings, which were more secretive. But a lot of the tombs that, going back to the age of pyramids, like Old Kingdom, most of them were robbed later, if you know about that. There is one weird thing about a lot of the necropolis sites. A lot of them were built on the West Bank, which a lot of it had to do with like Egyptian theology. In fact, the belief that I guess the belief was that the souls, when people died, their souls went to the west where the sun set, because they thought that the sun, or Ra, I guess we would call it Ra, the sun god, was eternal, never died. And the belief was that when Ra set in the west, his soul traveled through the underworld, came up in the east when the sun rose. So kind of, every day it would kind of, basically die and be reborn. So that's the belief of why they put, their tombs on the West Bank, etc. Now, they had different types of tombs that they built in ancient Egypt. Of course, there's the site of Abydos. Abydos is famous for a lot of things, not just like some of the early tombs that were built there. Like supposedly, like the King Menaz or Narmer's tomb was found there at Abydos, but they found actually this thing called the put it on the screen for you. It's called the Abydos King List. So it's not really that important of a deal, I guess, you need to know about. But they found this list of kings that was supposedly written down by King Seti I, who was a king pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. He was the father of Ramses the Great. And that list was kind of important because it kind of gave an entire list of all the major kings that they had of Egypt, at least up to the 19th dynasty. So it kind of gave us an idea of that. And so that's kind of why that's important with that site of Abydos. But it's the oldest necropolis site really in Egypt. They had different types of tombs. You see here, they had what they call mastaba or mastaba. It's usually pronounced either way. And the mastaba is a type of mud brick, flat-roofed, rectangular type tomb that was mostly built during the pre-dynastic period, like going back to Menez or Narmer's time, and then also built during the Old Kingdom. So they constructed these mud brick structures, which were built over a tomb that was actually underground, like the burial chamber was put underground, where you can see the shafts kind of going down into the earth. There's kind of another image right here. There's different translations of what the name means. Mastaba is more of an Arabic term, which means some will say stone bench, I think is a name that they'll use. Yeah, stone bench, or some people say mud bench also as well, or just bench. As I think the theory about that is that it looked like something you could sit on, like a bench, but then made of stone or really mud brick. That's what it was made of. Looks like stone, I guess. And then they had a hieroglyphic name they had too that the Egyptians called it, which was Perzet, I guess how you would say it in hieroglyphs, which means either house of eternity, or you could say it also reversed, I guess, eternal house, where your mummy would be put in, so your soul could live on, I guess forever. And they put different things in it. You can see they would, like, over time the interiors became more ornate. Probably painted the ceilings and I guess especially the walls, and then they put in like stuff with them, like food and drink and other things that they might need in the afterlife. But Obviously, it had some kind of shaft that went down to where the actual main chamber was. They put this superstructure on top of it. There are different size, like mastabas. Like this one was called Mastaba number 17, which was built at Maidum, about 20, 30 miles to the south of Cairo, constructed by the Third Dynasty. I don't know if they know too much about it. They think it wasn't built really for a pharaoh, but for one of his maybe powerful ministers that was under one of the pharaohs. They think that's who it was built for. But that's an example of a large size mastaba, what they look like. And so you can kind of see that this is like the early evolution of like tomb building in Egypt. And it's kind of like a precursor to like pyramids, because pyramids are eventually they're going to be stacking up stone, like a pyramid shape, step pyramid, or I guess what we call a smooth-sided pyramid later. But obviously, they use a lot of engineering and mathematics to build a lot of these structures. We'll see later. Here's another that's been kind of rebuilt in the Fourth Dynasty. Mastabat el Faran, also at Dashur, another necropolis site about 20, 30 miles south of Cairo, which means the bench of the pharaoh. That's what it translates. Of course, that's meaning. But they say that mastabas were built up to the New Kingdom, but they're rare. They don't build too many of those because most of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom bury themselves in like the Valley of the Kings in rock-cut tombs instead. Now, I want to move on. I want to talk about also the Third Dynasty, which really is the first major dynasty that comes in to what we call the Old Kingdom of Egypt. And there's King, pronounced Zoser, how they say it, spelled different ways. I think it's sometimes spelled Zesser or Zoser, and then you'll have a Z with it sometimes also as well. They think he may have been the second king of the Third Dynasty, reigning in the you can see at 27th century BC is the time period we're talking about. And that statue on the left there is a statue of King Zoser. They think it's, I think, the oldest statue of any pharaoh of Egypt they've ever found. He does have different names. Neterkit, I believe, is his other name he goes by, which I think that's one of the Egyptian names. I think it was called also as well. But what he's very famous for, he constructed the first actual real pyramid in Egypt, which was, by the way, built at a necropolis site called Saqqara, which was part of the, I guess, royal burial complex of basically Memphis, like right to the west of it. And I've got images, of course, showing the statue of Zoser right there with the step pyramid of Zoser, which was a six-step pyramid that he constructed. Which I think there was a theory that it was actually built as a mastaba, but it was really eventually converted into a step pyramid. The original height of the pyramid, they think, was about 205 feet tall, which if you want the meters, about 61, 62 meters. It's how tall they think originally it was. I think now it's kind of shorter, I think, maybe closer to like maybe 197 to 200 range. But the sides are kind of rectangular in shape. So 358 feet by about 397 feet. And it's famous for a lot of things. Some other, there's kind of an image of the man they think that built it. They think it was constructed by this man named Imhotep, you may have heard of, who Imhotep was a chancellor, like a powerful minister that was under King Zoser. They think he was also some type of high priest who was a polymath that knew things like math and engineering. Also knew medicine. I think there's a theory that Imhotep was one of the fathers of Egyptian medicine because he was later deified, as a god of medicine in later Egypt. They made movies about him, Imhotep. I don't know if you ever, I don't know if you've seen the movie The Mummy. I think there's been several mummy movies I think have been made, but I know they took the character of Imhotep, who was a real person, they made him into this character into a movie. Imhotep, who's this evil priest and all that, trying to resurrect the mummy and all that. But they think he was a powerful minister that was really the brains behind the construction of this particular temple. You see there, it is the oldest stone building in the world. They do think it still is today. So you can see it dates back, thousands of years, and they have since restored it. It's been kind of, I want to say in 2020 they reconstructed a little, kind of rebuilding it a little bit on the outside. And here's kind of what it looks like now, after they kind of fixed it up a few years ago. It does include some, and here's kind of like, I'll show you like real quick here, just kind of an outline of Zoser's pyramid here. So yeah, one thing about it, the burial chamber was put underground. I think that there's actually a main burial shaft that goes down about 80, 90 feet. So they probably constructed that first as they were building the superstructure above it. So burial chamber was like way underground. Like later future chambers are going to be built inside the actual pyramid. And then they constructed what is mostly, I think the burial chambers up below the surface is predominantly like granite. Outside the pyramid, it's mostly limestone also as well. So they use limestone and granite for most of the construction of the actual pyramid. So they do think it was maybe started out as a mastaba and then it was converted into a pyramid. It does include like a hall of columns. It's like kind of like probably a mortuary temple that was kind of added onto it as well, where they could bring the body of, I guess, Zoser to be mummified on site before they put him in the actual pyramid. Is too. So that was the first, real pyramid constructed in Egypt. Over time, they're going to go from like step pyramids, which is what that is, to like a smooth-sided pyramid over time. So between the third and the fourth dynasties, they'll eventually, of course, do that. Now, yeah, here, of course, is the other pharaoh that's kind of famous, which is King Sneferu, who's a fourth dynasty pharaoh who is really considered the pharaoh that really builds the first true pyramids in ancient Egypt. He lived between the 27th and the 26th centuries. He's kind of known for being the father of King Khufu, or Cheops, who, if you know about this, later built the Great Pyramid, the most famous pyramid constructed in ancient Egypt. And one thing about his reign, he's well known for constructing multiple pyramids, which you can see below, which were built at two different sites, one called Midim and another site called Dashur, which both are about 20, 30 miles to the south of Cairo. And I'll kind of go through and talk about some of these pyramids that he was famous for constructing. Here, of course, are the three he built right there. Again, Midim Pyramid, top left, of course, which I'll get to in a second. There's kind of a debate about whether he built it or not. Then the one on the right top is the Bent Pyramid. And then the one on the bottom is the Red Pyramid, which the Red Pyramid is more famous of the three. That, of course, particular pyramid is really considered the first true pyramid, especially smooth-sided pyramid that was really constructed. Here, of course, is the Midim Pyramid right here. They think there's kind of debate about it today, but they think it may have actually been built at the end of the third time. There was actually this pharaoh named Huni. They think that may have actually constructed it. And they believe that, I guess what could have happened was that King Sneferu came behind and decided to use it as his tomb, but they think what happened was it collapsed, or at least partially collapsed. And they think the original height of this particular pyramid was maybe around 300 feet tall, but they think now, because of the collapse of it, or partial collapse of it, really, it's about maybe 213 feet. So I don't know if that's really important, the height and all that, but it's kind of debatable what kind of pyramid it was. It may have been I guess, going to be a smooth-sided pyramid, or step pyramid, but you can see it's mostly collapsed with some debris around it. Now, of course, the pyramid that's some of the ones that are more famous that he constructed is the Bent Pyramid, which is also known as the South Pyramid. It's got different names that they called it. I know the hieroglyphic name they call the pyramid sometimes is the Southern Shining Pyramid. It's been called sometimes, or Sneferu is shining in the south, I think is another translation of the hieroglyphs of what it meant. But in modern times, they started calling it another name, which is Bent Pyramid. And you can see the part of why that pyramid was nicknamed that, because it has a bent shape to it, which it did. And that pyramid, its original height was built to about 344 feet tall. Current height, they think now is more like 332 feet. But you can see one thing about these pyramids, which is very interesting about them, was that each sides were pretty much equal. So about 619 feet on each side was about the length of each side right there. So a lot of pyramids were square on the base, and then pretty much a three-dimensional object, which pyramids, of course, were. It's called bent because it has like two different inclinations to the slope. So the bottom slope of the pyramid was built to like a 54-degree angle. And then the top part, you kind of see halfway up, it kind of changes the angle on it, about 43 degrees. And so that's what gave it its nickname. Now, why they did that, there's been a lot of debates about it. They're not really sure, like why the Bent Pyramid was constructed in that fashion. They think it may have been done on purpose, like built in that fashion. But another theory, I think the main theory that's more popular, is that they were constructing at a 54-degree angle and realized that that wouldn't work, building the pyramid. So halfway up, they changed the angle on it. So a lot of pyramids later are more like in the 40, 50-degree slope range, It's about where they were. I think 51 degrees is the Great Pyramid or something like that, the slope on it. Here, of course, is another image. You can see, by the way, one thing that's very famous about the Bent Pyramid, it was the first pyramid that starts to be smooth-sided. It's got smooth sides on it. And what they would do, they would take more expensive white limestone casings. They put like a facing on it. That's what they would do. They would sand it down so it's like real polished and shiny. And now it would go on the outside of the pyramids, because the theory about the pyramids later was that they were all white looking. But since, ancient times, they've been stripped off, a lot of them. But you can see an example of, what the pyramids may have looked like a long time ago. You'll also see it with the Pyramid of Khafre, with the Giza pyramids. Then you got the Red Pyramid. The Red Pyramid is considered to be the first true smooth-sided pyramid that was constructed. So they were successful with this pyramid. That ends up being the tomb of King Sneferu. That's where they would bury him in the tomb. It is called sometimes the North Pyramid because it's located north of the other South Bent Pyramid, hence the different names being used. And it was built in the 26th century BC. So 2500 something BC is when it was constructed, over 4500, maybe 4500 something years ago. And that's the original height of the Red Pyramid, about 344, 45 feet. It's usually about where they think the height was built to. But since then, it's kind of been stripped off because they took the capstone off of it. And of course, now it's a little shorter than what it was. But you can see that the actual length of each side is about the same, 722 feet on each side, like I said. Why do they call it the Red Pyramid? Well, a long time ago, they had put the white limestone facings on it, so it looked white looking. So nobody knew about the color and all that. But what happened was apparently the Egyptians, when they constructed the Red Pyramid, they used local limestone quarries which had like a reddish limestone, and so that's what gave it its color. But most of the limestone in Egypt that they used to build most of the pyramids was carved out of quarries near a place called Tura, which is kind of like south of Cairo, just south of it, a few miles. That's where they got most of their limestone and I guess their granite or whatever. And but that's kind of one of the unique things of why it's called the Red Pyramid. But yeah, it got stripped off, and so that's the you can see like the debris around it too. That image, of course, right here. There's another thing about it too. They do sometimes call it the Bat Cave. I don't know if you heard of this before, but there's a lot of bats that live in it, and so hence locals sometimes call it that also as well. Also, one thing about the tomb is like well, the burial chambers are actually put in it. That's one thing you start seeing in a lot of these pyramids, and it's got like a corbel type interior, which is kind of similar to like an arch. Would be kind of what that is. Like especially in like Roman times, and so they use like the stones kind of going up like that at an angle to create like an arch effect, to create like chambers inside, uh, rooms inside of it. So that's so-called Red Pyramid. Now they do have what they call a pyramidion. And kind of easily talk about that as well. Most pyramids they put a capstone on the top of it, which is made of granite. And I think there's been theories about that. Maybe that the Egyptians a long time ago may have put gold on it or something, like kind of a gold top, possibly, maybe bronze. And that's some theories about maybe what the pyramids look like, that they were all white with a gold top, etc. Now, let me get to the next thing I want to talk about with, of course, pyramid evolution of the construction back then. They have the Great Pyramid of Giza, which is built next during the Fourth Dynasty. That one, of course, if you know about the Great Pyramid, is the largest pyramid ever constructed, really, not just in ancient Egypt, but maybe in the world. I think there's the one that might be close to that one was built a long time ago. I know in Mexico, they got the Pyramid of the Sun you may have heard of, which is pretty large in size, but I don't think it's as tall as the Great Pyramid. This particular pyramid was constructed by a king we just talked about. There's the Giza pyramids we'll get to in a second, which were part of this huge burial complex that was put there. But it was constructed by King Khufu, who the Greeks also called Cheops. And he was a pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty. I think I told you that his father was King Sneferu, who had built several pyramids like the Red Pyramid. And that's actually the only statue of him that they've ever found of King Khufu, which is like a real small statue. I think that was found inside the actual Great Pyramid. And so under his reign, he took years to construct this pyramid, and Herodotus claims that it was like around 20 years to construct, of course, the Great Pyramid. Here's kind of a map showing you the actual burial complex of Giza, Giza Plateau outside Cairo, where they constructed all these different tombs in the old kingdom of the Fourth Dynasty. So there's like three main pyramids you can see. They were part of this whole burial complex. The Pyramid of Khufu, which is the Great Pyramid, as they call it now. Pyramid of Khafre, which of course was his son of Khufu. And then Menkaure also was the son of Khafre. He built the pyramid, which was not as large compared to the other two. His is located more to the bottom. And then bottom left, you can see. And then also, if you go to the right of Pyramid of Khafre, you can see there was a huge causeway that went to where the Sphinx is, the Great Sphinx that was constructed there, which was part of a temple complex called the Temple of Sphinx. And you can see it's got a lot of cemeteries, which some of these are for royalty, but there's also actual burial sites for like a lot of the workers that constructed it. So here's kind of an image, of course, of the Great Pyramid. Current height is kind of debated about it, but here's some stats, of course, about it. But yeah, they think it's the oldest and the only surviving of the seven wonders of the ancient world that the Greeks talked about a long time ago. So the oldest one and the only one still around today. They think 482 feet or close to it. See, it's kind of debated about 481, 482, kind of as kind of the actual height of what they think it was built to, like a long time ago. 147 meters if you want that version of it too as well. So I'll just say 480, kind of easy to remember. 756 feet on each side, which I think the size of the whole pyramid itself, I think it takes up something like 13 acres of land. That's how large it actually is. By Napoleon's time, they had figured out that roughly maybe the actual pyramid has something like 2.3 million stone blocks actually inside of it. That's the whole, like the whole thing, whole pyramid itself. They think it was the largest structure built, especially the highest one built in the world for like almost 4,000 years. I think, I think after that, it's like I want to say the Eiffel Tower, maybe in the 19th century, which went way past it, almost 1,000 feet. Wasn't built till the 1800s to kind of give you an idea. Some other things, of course, about it, like some stats you might want to know about. They think that the height now might be like 455 feet because it was stripped. Like all the white limestone casing was stripped off. They took off the pyramidion or capstone was taken from it. It's kind of debated about what happened to it. I don't know if they've ever found it. The actual capstone that's on it. 455 feet might be the actual original, what the height is now, excuse me. They think that the average weight of a stone block in the pyramid is somewhere between 2 to 6 tons, which I think the average weight is 2.5 tons. But they think that most of the stones that are the heaviest are on the bottom when they were actually constructing it a long time ago. Now, how do we get a lot of our historical records, of course, about like the Great Pyramid and some of the other pyramids? They think the oldest source is Herodotus. Herodotus, of course, writing about almost 2,500 years ago in Book 2 of the Histories, is really our oldest source we have on the pyramid construction throughout Egypt. He had different theories on how the pyramids were constructed. First of all, he said that a lot of the pharaohs that reigned, like King Khufu and also King Khafre, were despots, that they used like slave labor to construct the pyramids. I think maybe up to 100,000 slaves may have been used. But now they think that that's not true, that a lot of the labor that was actually used may have been skilled labor, maybe farmers that weren't working like during the inundation may have been employed. They also paid them, I think, like in like food and things like that. I think they may have paid them that way instead of actual wages. I think he even said they had lever systems or pulley systems, but they don't seem to think that that was probably in use at that time. And no scaffolding either was constructed. No draft animals were used either, they think, in the construction of the actual pyramid. I'll kind of show you some images here. They do think that the Egyptians may have used some kind of ramping systems, like probably made of like mud brick, where they would build ramps up to the pyramid, and then use brute force, like human force, no draft animals, to move a lot of the stone blocks into place. So very difficult, but it took skill, to cut them out, precision cutting of the actual stones and putting them into place. So some of that was actually skilled workers that were involved in doing that. But a lot of the other ones were probably more laborers, and they actually they found some like of their graves of some of the workers, and some was back-breaking work that they were literally doing. So yeah, and here's got an outline of Khufu's pyramid. There's even a theory that they may have had internal ramps that were in it as well, not just on the outside. They're just not sure what happened to the ramps. I guess they had to dismantle them or whatever. But they do have like a lot of different chambers that kind of are in Khufu's Great Pyramid. There's one at the bottom called the false tomb chamber you see that was built like under the pyramid, which there's been debates about why that was constructed there. I think some historians or Egyptologists think it was built there to kind of fool maybe the tomb robbers into thinking that that was where the burial chamber of Khufu was. But they have other ones too, like they got the Queen's Chamber as well, which I know during Arab times when the Arabs kind of took over Egypt, they thought it had been used as a burial chamber for one of the wives of Khufu, but they don't think that's true now. I think the theory is that they put a statue of Khufu in there, which represented his soul, but they're not sure about that. There's also this main grand gallery that runs up to where the king's chamber is. And that's the main chamber where they think Khufu was buried in with all his treasures, which originally was blocked with huge stones. Stone blocks that were put there to prevent tomb robbers from breaking in, but they still broke into it anyway and robbed it. And nothing remains, of course, of his tomb, his actual burial chamber. They put those relieving blocks, by the way. I don't know if you see that or not, but they put those above the actual king's chamber to prevent the pyramid collapsing down on the actual main chamber, which is pretty good fit of engineering there, I think. And then there's also some other strange stuff they found too in Khufu's pyramid. They found air shafts in it as well. You can see going out, which there's a theory about that those were put in there to allow Khufu's soul to leave the pyramid or something like that. But they're not sure about that, about whether that's true or not. They have found other chambers, and I think there's a deal where a few years ago they found like another chamber in it or something like that. They found where they sent robots to look at it. There might be other chambers or rooms in it. They don't really know for sure. They would probably have to take it apart, the whole pyramid, to see what's actually in it. But there are some theories I've read where some people think that there's some kind of internal ramps or something that may have been constructed in it too, as well, not just outside of it as well. Here, of course, that's the empty sarcophagus, of course, of where Khufu was, they think, laid to rest. And you can see it kind of looks like it's been ripped open on one side. Though I've actually heard that that's actually from partially that, but also from people going into the chamber years ago, chipping away at the actual sarcophagus and taking a piece of it home with them. There, of course, the statue of Khufu, which was supposedly found in the pyramid as well. So not much remains of, I guess, what was treasure that was probably buried in there with them a long time ago. Then they have another pyramid, of course, they constructed, which is the pyramid of Khafre. Khafre is a son of Khufu who reigned as pharaoh afterwards. His pyramid is like the second largest ever constructed in ancient Egypt. He basically his was like 471 feet tall, so it's almost just as tall as Khufu's Great Pyramid. They think the current height is more like 448 feet tall now after it's been stripped. But one thing that's very interesting about that particular pyramid is you can see it does still have part of its white limestone casing. That's one thing that's really unique about Khafre. Khafre, by the way, reigned from about 2558 to about 2532 BC. So he reigned for almost 30 years as pharaoh. Yeah, you can see the sides are about 706 feet on each side. It's not as elaborate as Khufu's pyramid. They have only one chamber in it, which there was this Italian explorer who was very famous in the 19th century named Giovanni Belzoni, who found other tombs throughout Egypt. But he was one of the first ones in modern times to go into it and into Khafre's pyramid and explored a lot. And he found this chamber in it where they think Khafre was buried, and so it got named after him. Belzoni's chamber, I think is what they called it later. But his is more simpler on the inside of it. But both those pyramids are huge. Some people even confuse the pyramid of Khafre with the Great Pyramid, but that's how you figure out which one it is. The one that's got the white limestone casing on it still. There's another image. There's a statue of Khafre. Khafre was sometimes called his Greek name, which was Khephren. So they also called him that as well as Pharaoh. I think there's been a theory that he had to finish his father's pyramid and then he began his. That's how long it was taking to construct, these pyramids. And later, the construction of these huge pyramids, they think it helped bankrupt the state, spending so much money on it. Now, one thing they think that's real famous, of course, about they think the Giza pyramids is the Great Sphinx that was constructed at the Giza complex about the same time when they were building like Khufu's Great Pyramid and, of course, Khafre's pyramid. And the theory about that particular pyramid, that particular statue, royal statue, is that they believe it was built by King Khafre. That's the popular theory they have about it, is that he built this actual statue to honor his father, who had built the Great Pyramid just recently. And if you know about the Sphinx is a kind of a type of character that goes back to ancient Egypt. It's kind of a mythical creature, which is part lion, and then of course has the head of a human with it. They think the Sphinx, this type of creature, I guess in a sense represented the king, especially the power of the king. And if you know about why they chose, the lion to represent that, it's because of the fact that the lion is seen as ferocious, and so is supposed to be the pharaoh, in a sense. So it's built in the 26th century BC. You can see that's the dimensions of it. So it's about 240 feet long by about 62 feet wide, and then from the paws, down the bottom of it to the top of its head, it's about 66 feet high. Of course, it's called different names. The Sphinx, the Great Sphinx, I think, is the common name that they usually call it today in Egypt. It has been buried multiple times, which is true about that. I think a long time ago, when the ancient Greeks took over Egypt, like Alexander the Great, it was buried. And so a lot of people thought it was a statue standing up. They didn't think it had a lion's body or anything to it. But it has been unburied, a few times. The most famous king of Egypt that had it unburied was a pharaoh named Tutmosis or Tutmosis IV, who was of the 18th dynasty. And supposedly he had this dream that if he unburied the Sphinx, he would become pharaoh, and he did. And so he put this what they call the dream stele up in front of it, which represents that dream, that he had. You'll see a lot of images of it. It doesn't have a nose. Why is that? Well, they think in modern times, soldiers would use it for target practice. And they shot the nose off of it, and they think that the Turks may have done that. At least the Turkish times when the Ottoman Empire controlled that part of Egypt. Yeah, I know a lot of the people in like Egypt were kind of suspicious of it. They were very superstitious of it. They thought it was always watching you wherever you were. I guess if you're looking at the Sphinx, it looked like it was looking right at you, the way the eyes were with it. A lot of people call it the Father of Terror, was one of its nicknames. So here's another image, of course, of the Sphinx. It has gone through a lot of disrepair. They've had to repair it over the years. There's some theories some people put forth. I don't know if it's true or not, but some people think the Sphinx, like the actual, where the actual statue is actually older than what it is. That they think it was actually a natural type of limestone that was actually there, and the Egyptians came and basically constructed this out of it. So the actual limestone's older than actual statues built. It wasn't moved there. They just took natural limestone and constructed it. Also, other theories are there's stuff buried under it. Some people have talked about that. They've actually had cases where people have actually tried to uh, dig under it to see what's there. Then they have Menkaure. Just want to talk about him too as well. Menkaure is the other pharaoh that reigned over the fourth dynasty of the that built the Giza pyramids. He was the son of King Khafre that reigned. He reigned a short time, by the way. I think he was in power from 2532 to 2503 BC. It's about roughly when he reigned. He built the smallest of the three Giza pyramids, which are about 200 feet tall. That's how tall that one was that was built. Why was it built so small? Obviously, one theory is that economically they couldn't build larger pyramids anymore because they had spent so much money building the Great Pyramid and the Pyramid of Khafre that it was bankrupting the country. And so a lot of pyramids built afterwards are smaller than this one that were constructed. Herodotus had another theory. He called it Mykerinos, that this particular pharaoh was more benevolent, like a nice pharaoh, didn't want to really uh, use all this labor to, force people to build such massive tombs. And so that's why his was, much smaller in size. That's the original height. Like I said, actually 215 actually is the original height, they think. And now it's like 204, 205. It's about where it is now, the height. But you can see the sides, 339 feet on each side. You can see how much smaller it is, of course, compared to the other bigger pyramids that they have. They do have other pyramids, like the Queen's pyramids were also constructed as well at the site, which the Queen's pyramids are these pyramids that King Khufu or Cheops built for two of his wives and also one for his mother. So that kind of kills the whole theory that the Queen's chamber might be, where they could have buried one of his queens, but they don't think so because of that. The one that's the most famous one is Queen Hatteferes. That's her pyramid right there, which is the one that's in best condition. The other two are kind of not good condition as much anymore. But that was his mother, so she's got the best pyramid, of course, that's still there. So that's Khufu's mother. They also built boats. I don't know if you know, they've actually reconstructed an actual boat of Khufu's that's on site. So these were constructed out of like wood, papyrus, and the actual pharaohs actually believed that they would need these in the next world, like in the underworld. They'd be, I guess, taking a celestial voyage, that kind of thing. I think there's even a case where they take some of their servants, kill them, and put them in there with the chamber with them and stuff like that. I think they may have done that also as well. But I think they had like statues that they would put in which represent servants that would help them, in the afterlife, not just putting in, treasure and food and drink and things like that, but everything that they would need, they were given for the next life. Yeah, they have later pyramids. I don't usually go into those. Like the fifth dynasty, that's the King Unas is his name. He was one of the last pharaohs of the fifth dynasty that came after the fourth. And a lot of the pyramids in the fifth, sixth dynasty and later pyramids aren't built very well. They're kind of falling apart and look more like a bunch of rubble than actual pyramids. Although the chambers that are actually inside the pyramids are still, in good condition. Just that the later pyramids were not built very well after the fourth dynasty. His pyramid is famous for one thing that's well known. You may have heard about. The Egyptians started putting what they call the pyramid texts inside the pyramids. That's where they put the Egyptian funerary texts, or we call the Book of the Dead, like on the wall, which were spells and incantations, etc., that would allow, I guess, the king's soul to make it through the underworld. So that's what that was. And so you see that a lot starting from the fifth dynasty up to like the New Kingdom, etc. You see on King Tut's wall and stuff like that. Let me spend also a few minutes today talking about hieroglyphs as well. And Tristan's saying that they shrink because of sea level. A lot of it was because they were stripped. You know, a lot to do with it. A lot of the actual pyramids, they would take off the best limestone and all that, and they would use it to build buildings. Like in Cairo, they built a lot of buildings out of it using like the best limestone and stuff like that. And so that's why a lot of them shrunk over time. So most of the white limestone casing was stripped off the Great Pyramid. You only see it like a little bit on the top. That could have caused it too, like weather stuff, erosion, but that's mostly why was from humans, stripping them off, etc. But yeah, they were some of the tallest structures in the world until like the 19th century. A lot of these actual pyramids. Yeah, hieroglyphs. Talk a little bit about that as well. Hieroglyphs was like the writing system that they referred to in ancient Egypt that dates back something like 5,000 years ago, which are different types of hieroglyphic writing systems that they had. Most of it was an alphabet, by the way, like almost like A to Z that they had. But a lot of it was syllabic. A lot of it was using like logograms, which represented like ideas or objects. And here's kind of alphabet of what it looked like, but you clearly, spell your name with it if you want, like A to Z here. But they're not sure, like exactly, what they called it. Like a long time ago, like the Greeks. We'll get to the Rosetta Stone in a second, but the Greeks were the ones that coined the term hieroglyph or hieroglyphics in ancient times. And what happened was over time, the actual language became dead. Nobody could read it and all that because of the rise of Christianity, like in the Mediterranean, like especially in Egypt when the Romans came in. They killed off all the priests that kind of knew the actual writing system. And the term hieroglyphs comes from like two words. Hiero is a Greek word meaning sacred or priestly, because the priests in a lot of the temples, like in Egypt, were the ones that knew the language. So it was a very complicated language too, which I think had like something like 1,000 characters at one point. And then the word glyph is, you see there, writings or carvings, because it was either written on papyrus, like paper, or carved on like stone or pottery or something like that. And so hence the name, of course, being used. But I think the Romans killed off all the priests that kind of knew the languages. And so in the Middle Ages, it was kind of like a dead language that nobody really understood. Now, what caused all the change and why we know the language is because of Napoleon Bonaparte. You see that image right there. Napoleon, 1798, famous French general, later Emperor of France in the early 1800s, invaded Egypt. He did that because France was at war with the British Empire. This later spawns the so-called Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century. And Napoleon went to Egypt not just to take control of Egypt and maybe destroy Britain's trade routes, which were connected like Asia, like India at the time. But Napoleon was interested in learning about ancient Egypt. He thought there were secrets that the Egyptians knew, that they had a lot to learn about. So he brought like scientists, and artists, historians, and other peoples to kind of create a record of Egypt. And I think later they even published a work called The Description of Egypt I think in the 1800s, which was one of the first works that led to Egyptology being spawned. That's his famous quote: "Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you." When, of course, he invaded in 1798. What's famous, though, is they found this stone in modern Egypt, which was called the Rosetta Stone. It dated back to the second century. They think it was a type of stone inscription which dated to the Ptolemaic era, Ptolemaic Egypt. This was after Alexander the Great had conquered Egypt, and the Ptolemaic dynasty reigned down to the time of Queen Cleopatra. And there was a king named King Ptolemy V Epiphanes, I think is his full name, who reigned around that time. And they evidently they had this stone that had an inscription on it, which talked about his coronation. And so that's kind of why we know something about the language later, because it ends up being this decipher key in being able to decipher it. And there was actually a soldier that found it. I kind of mentioned him. His name was Pierre Francois Bouchard. He was a French engineer in Napoleon's army, and he founded a fort in Rosetta. Rosetta, I told you, was a small town that was in the Delta, and it was in a fort. It was called Fort Julian. And that's where they found it. It was found in the wall, the actual fort. He pulled it out, and Bouchard realized that it was an important artifact that he had discovered. So the French later got a copy of it. And if you look at this image right here, there's the Rosetta Stone on the left. It's pretty heavy. I think they say it weighs about, I want to say, about 1,000 pounds. So it's not like you're going to be able to carry it away or anything like that. Apparently, the man on the right, Jean-Francois Champollion, he was actually this French language expert that got a copy of it, a copy of the Rosetta Stone, and he began translating it, which I think he finished it, I want to say, in 1822. He was the first one to actually read Rosetta Stone and decipher the language. And Champollion realized that hieroglyphs was like an alphabet, kind of a complicated one compared to later alphabets, but it's something that was kind of earth-shattering to a lot of people. I think he even passed out when he figured it out, by the way. But it ends up changing everything, because then they could read all the different hieroglyphs, that's in Egypt in modern times. Those were all the languages that were on it. The one at the top was hieroglyphs, like traditional hieroglyphs that they wrote it in first. And then the second one in the middle was called Demotic. If you know about hieroglyphs, they had cursive forms, by the way, which I'll kind of list them here for you. But the different ones, the cursive forms of hieroglyphs were hieratic. So I think I want to say dates back to at least the New Kingdom. And then Demotic was also used as well as another language. And I think Demotic was more for the common people, was what they wrote it. And then on the bottom, they wrote it in Greek also as well, because that's the language that Alexander the Great brought in, when the Macedonians took over Egypt and created the Ptolemaic dynasty, etc. But yeah, it's kind of controversial if you know about it. It's now in the British Museum in London. I think in 1801, the British got it because they had defeated Napoleon forces in Egypt. Napoleon fled back to France. And I think from there on, between the 19th and 20th centuries, the British kind of have a lot of control over Egypt, modern Egypt. And yeah, there it is where it resides. Of course, now in the British Museum. So that is kind of a controversial. A lot of the Egyptians, like in Republic of Egypt, want it back and all that. Oh, why? Interesting story about, by the way, the Rosetta Stone. How was Champollion able to translate it? Champollion knew something called Coptic. You know about this? Coptic was like a form of Egyptian hieroglyphs that used Greek, which was used by a lot of Egyptian Christians in Egypt. And that's how they were able to translate it using Coptic. I think without that knowledge, they wouldn't have been able to translate it. So that's something interesting about, of course, the Rosetta Stone. So yeah, I'm going to get to it later. You can see here. We'll kind of like next week. I'll move on. I will for a few minutes talk about the Middle Kingdom. I usually don't talk much about it because it's not that great, the Middle Kingdom. But I'll briefly talk about that historical period. Then mostly I'm going to talk about the New Kingdom, which is more known for its great pharaohs that reigned over it, and some of the temples that they constructed at that time, because the New Kingdom is really the peak period of ancient Egypt. It's an empire building period in their history, but it kind of occurs at the end of the Bronze Age, going into the Iron Age. You can see there.